você que tem que iniciar. E por conta da nossa convidada de hoje, o encontro será conduzido em inglês e depois a gente vai disponibilizar a gravação. Também, se alguém se sentir mais confortável falando em português ou tiver alguma dúvida, pode mandar aqui no chat que a gente ajuda na tradução. So, starting with the English, I'd like to thank you so much, Neela, for joining us today. It's such an honor to have you here. It's someone I really admire in the behavioral science community. And just introducing a little bit about our guest today. Neela is an applied behavioral scientist and interested in applying research to problems of behavioral change in health, financial inclusion, and charitable giving in the Global South. She's a senior advisor at the Busara Center for Behavioral Economics and a consultant with Surgo Foundation and advisor at Varamone and Nora Health. And she is also the founding director of the Center for Social and Behaviour Change at Ashoka University in India. So our topic today is to discuss a bit about the weirdness in behavioral science. So we rely a lot on experiments that have been based on really biased samples of weird countries, so Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. And this may not be so representative of what is human behavior or human nature. So Neela strongly advocates for non-weird applications of behavioral science, and it's a pleasure to have her here today and to hear a bit about her thoughts. So what we thought, Neela is going to give a brief introduction about the theme, and then we open to discussions, and please feel free to engage in the discussions as we really appreciate in those meetings. And just introducing, if is anyone new here for the first time, we are Grupo de Estudos em Economia Comportamental, G.E.E.C, behavioral economic study groups that meets once a month. So if you want to take part of the group, please message me that I can add you to our platforms. So without further prolonging, please, Neela, you have the word. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm actually quite thrilled to be talking to one of my favorite people in the world, Brazilians. I visited Brazil only once. I came to Sao Paulo about 6-7 years ago when I was with Pepsi. We were doing some market research. And the only Portuguese I know is obrigada and estou feliz de estar aqui, which I learned this morning. But you might notice that I do have actually a Portuguese surname. And that's Saldanha, and that's, well, we call it Saldanha in India. And that's an account of the fact that we were also colonized by the Portuguese. And so several people converted from Hinduism to Catholicism. So I grew up, there are like 2% or 1% of India's population is Roman Catholic. So you know, talk about weird. I grew up in a country which is 85% Hindu, and the rest Muslim, and very small proportion of Catholic in a predominantly Catholic household. My mother's name is Siqueira, and I have friends who are Mascarenhas, Pereira, Pinto, Dissa, De Silva. So I feel like when I came to Sao Paulo, everyone talked to me in Portuguese, and I had to say, I don't understand, I'm Indian. So the world is much smaller than we think we are. I just wanted to say that I'm really sorry I don't speak Portuguese, and my accent might be a bit difficult. If you are having any difficulties understanding me, please ask me to slow down. Indians speak very fast, so I'm going to try and slow down. As for questions, I'm very happy if you want to write them in Portuguese and have Flora or Arthur tell me in English. So, you know, whatever works, we'll see how this works. So, you know, I'm very interested. I really jumped at the opportunity to have this discussion today because I actually grew up in India and I worked there for many years. And I came to the US, well, relatively late in life to do a PhD in marketing. So I come from a marketing background. I did an MBA, and then I worked with Nestle and with Unilever and with Accenture. And then I decided to do a PhD. So I came to the US, to Wharton. And I did a PhD in in marketing, and a lot of that was behavioral economics. So it was very interesting that, that was my introduction to behavioral economics. I'm not an economist, I'm a marketer. And after I did my PhD, I went back to work with Pepsi in the US in a global team. And then 3 years ago, I sort of transitioned to India to set up a Center for Social and Behaviour Change. It was funded by the G.E.E.C Foundation. And the idea of the center is to develop evidence-based behavior change communication for low-income and marginalized populations. And I think ever since I was a student, like 10, 12 years ago, I think, I always thought, this is so strange that all of these things that we're learning in behavioral economics, it's so US based, and I had just come from India. One of the professors on my dissertation committee was Professor Paul Rosen. He's a psychologist at the University of Pennsylvania. And he was very interested in Indian culture, very interested in this. And I think he opened my eyes to the fact that, what we're talking about is findings based on a very, very small segment of the population. But, you do your PhD. I also did mine with undergrads in the US. And it wasn't until I actually went to India many years later that I realized just how weird behavior science as it stands today is. So I'm actually really excited that there's a group in Brazil, and it seems to be quite large, and groups in other parts of the world. So what I'll do today is, I don't know if you managed to send out that article, Flora, the one that I referenced, but if not, no worries. I realized that the whole thing is almost like a book. It's 75 pages. So I'm not expecting anyone to read it. I'll summarize some of that article because it's really, and I would really advise you to read it at some point. It's probably the most comprehensive article that I have seen about behavior science and W.E.I.R.D. And Joe Heinrich actually has a book out recently about W.E.I.R.D. And behavior science. And then I'll talk a little bit about my experience in India and how we sort of ran some experiments and some of the learnings and some of the work that the team is still doing there, and maybe open it up to a discussion as to how can we make behavior science less weird. I'd love to hear your thoughts. This is what I love to do, and to evangelize and to sort of have people talking about this. Okay, so I'll have some slides, but it's only to keep the discussion on track. And I'm happy to have, I'm happy to have people jump in as I'm talking. So there's no like, this is the presentation and then these are the questions or whatever. And I'd love a discussion. Okay, so let me share my screen. Whether you can see it. Can you see my screen? Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay. So, for those of you who are not familiar with this, the term W.E.I.R.D, I love this term. It's because it's really a rich term. It stands for Western, Educated, Industrialized, Rich, and Democratic. And it was coined by, in this article, it mentions, Joe Heinrich and their team coined this term. And it came from their understanding of looking at psychology journals and seeing that something like, and I'm going to reference this paper, something like 99% of all the articles in the psychology journals were actually from people written by academics in Western countries. And something like 96% of all the studies came from the parts of the world that you can see in blue that really represent 12% of the world's population. In other words, all that we know about behavioral science is based on like 12% of the world's population. And I noticed this as well when I was doing my, my work, which is that overwhelmingly in the US, the sample is undergrads. It's US undergrads. So actually, behavioral science is a study of not about human psychology, but about American undergrad psychology. That's what it really is. And interestingly, what was shocking to me when I read this article, so I knew that this was the issue, but I didn't realize how much of an issue it was. What was really shocking to me is where they say that psychology, so they look at all the sciences, psychology is the worst in this aspect. So in chemistry, for example, they say that the number of citations that came from the United States is about 40%. And psychology was more than all 19 sciences. So in other words, the science that's supposed to be the most social science, the most about human behavior and context, is the least diverse. And even something like chemistry that we think of as a basic science is the science that's much more diverse. Yeah, you know, so this definition of what is weird is kind of interesting. I haven't really found, so I think it corresponds a lot with Global South, because, you know, there is I would say Turkey is probably in that, is not in that. It's not considered because it's non-Western, but it's an interesting thing. And I want to ask, you know, Joe Heinrich, whether there is the overlap between what we call Global South, which is very much which is basically US, non-US, Europe, Israel, and Australia, and W.E.I.R.D, which is what they call these countries. So it's a good question as to which countries fall in. And then there are some countries, like I wouldn't have thought Israel would fall into this definition of W.E.I.R.D, but it does. So, so yeah, that's kind of interesting to have. So, you know, I just want to call out a few things in the paper, and I'll have you actually read the paper. Just 1 minute. Yeah. Okay.
Sorry, I sent to the people in WhatsApp group, but I have read it, but not sure.
No, don't worry. I'll just give you an outline of the paper, and then you can, it's not, you know, just to give you some of the key findings. And then I think it's better if I do it that way, and then people can read it later. Yeah. So the paper basically, it's a huge commentary. So the authors, and I'll just talk about a couple of things, but it's really a very comprehensive view of W.E.I.R.D and non-W.E.I.R.D. So what they do is that they show a number of findings where, if you contrast it with, you know, other countries, these findings don't hold true. So the first contrast they do, so remember W.E.I.R.D is Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic. So the first contrast the authors do is with industrialized versus non-industrialized societies. And it's quite interesting. And, you know, I'll leave you to like go over all the details, but I just want to call out a few differences. So the authors compare like industrialized societies like the US to like much smaller scale hunter-gatherer kind of societies. I'm sure you have a lot of this in Brazil. In India, we would have a lot of this in tribal populations, for example, Aboriginal populations. So even something, so most psychologists say that something like visual perception, you know, the way we see the world or illusions, they should be the same across humanity. They actually find that it's not so. So there is an illusion called the Muller Lion, where, you know, I don't know where you've seen it. It's the one with the arrow and the line, and you're asked to see where the two lines are equal. It's there in the paper. Even that, you know, some tribes don't have it, and in the US it's very strong. I don't know if you're familiar with the ultimatum game and the dictator game, right? The ultimatum game is when you offer people money, two people, you offer them money, a certain amount out of, say, whatever, $10. And the other person is free to refuse. And if they refuse, both of you don't get anything. That's the ultimatum game. The dictator game is very similar. You offer people money, but they don't have the right to refuse or not refuse. They have to take whatever you give them. So in the US, when they've done studies, they find that most people offer about 50%, even though the rational thing to offer would be like literally $1, because you know, it's the least that you can offer, but it's the, you know, the other person doesn't really, you know, it's better than getting nothing, so they should take it. But typically people offer about 40 to 50%. So from that, psychologists said, look, people are really quite fair, and they, you know, human beings are not necessarily just always very selfish and rational, except that when they look at different cultures, they find out that this is not true. So in cultures, for example, where there's a lot of face-to-face contact, when they play this game, people don't know the other person. And so then they offer the minimum possible. Okay, because they just don't know, this person is not from my community. The way that I treat people fairly is people from my community. So they find a lot of variation even in something like this. And so, you know, the question is fairness, what kind of fairness is really a human universal? Another very interesting one, which I thought was categorization. So when I grew up in an urban city in India, and when most people grow up, when a child, even my daughter, she grew up in America. If she points to something like a tree, so what is that? I'll say that's a tree. And I thought that's the way we learn how to categorize things, right? This thing that looks like a tree is a tree. Well, it turns out in some places, especially those are much closer to nature, people don't learn this basic categorization. That's a tree, that's not a tree. They actually learn the type of trees. So if you went to a hunter-gatherer society or a small-scale non-industrialized society, and a child were to ask, what is that? The parent or the elder would actually say, that's a maple. They wouldn't say that's a tree. And then the child realizes, like, okay, these different things are all part of one category called tree. And it really shocked me when I heard that, because I always assume that's the way you learn categories. That's a bird, that's a tree. And they say that's not true. The one I find most fascinating is this one on spatial cognition. So in the US, you'll often say something is to the left of me or something is to the right of me. It turns out that there are some tribes primarily in Australia, I think it is, and Queensland, where they don't use the word left and right because they find that very egocentric, very much part of the self. So they will say, this person is west, or this person is east. They have no term for left and right, because remember, left and right is my left is your right, and vice versa. So they don't have this relative way of speaking. They have like an absolute way of speaking where they talk, this person is in the west, this person is in the east, which is so fascinating, to me. So there were all these differences between industrialized and small scale societies, and the authors talk a lot about it, and you can find some really cool examples in the paper. Some things are very similar in industrial and small scale societies, they find. So some illusions are similar. The way people perceive color, the fact that they do identify certain colors, although, the words for certain colors will be different in different languages. Some emotions, not all of them. So, I'm sure this is true even of Portuguese, but in Hindi, there are very different words even for the word love. So, there's the romantic love, which is a different word, ishq, and there is pyar, which is love, love in general, love that the mother has for the child, for example. And then there is dosti, which is more like friendship. And then there's prem. So there are different words even for the word love, depending on what that relationship is. And I'll tell you a very, really interesting story when I went to India a little later about, how different it is in terms of emotions. But by and large, happy, sad, pride, shame, people really, they understand these emotions across cultures. So that's, and then a few other similarities. So that's one difference, that things that at least that I thought of, were pretty common. And, I grew up in two cultures, in the sense of I grew up in India and went to the US. But I'm sure for most US people who grew up here, they would find this pretty shocking that the world doesn't behave like this. Another very interesting part where they show is between Western and non-Western cultures. And it's interesting. I don't know whether Brazil falls under a predominantly Western culture or a non-Western culture. Probably Western, but it would be interesting to figure it out. So, of course, punishment and cooperation. I want to talk about this idea of self-concept. So this idea of self-concept is that, do you think of yourself as an individual person or as part of a society? And this was my first introduction actually to weird behavior, because in India, at least, you definitely think about your role in society. You definitely think about yourself, not just as yourself, but as me, as a wife, a daughter, a student, or whatever. So it's not always the individualistic kind of choice. And what they lay out here are some very interesting differences. So Americans, for example, have the tendency, and you'll see it a lot, and I had this when I first came to America, they have this need for a very positive self-view. Like, self-esteem is based on a very positive self-view. And if you don't talk well of yourself, then people think that, you're sort of, you don't have good self-esteem. Well, it turns out in many cultures, including, say, in India and particularly in East Asia, self-esteem is not correlated with how positive your self-view is. You can have very high self-esteem and you can say, I'm not that great a person, right? So, this idea that the self is the most important doesn't exist. The other one I found very interesting, and Sheena Iyengar has a whole TED talk on this, is personal choice. So in the US, it turns out choice is really important. Americans love choice. They love more choices versus fewer choices, and they don't want their choice taken away from them. And Sheena Iyengar talks about this time when she actually asked the Americans to choose between 7, I think it is, sodas. And the Americans say, well, I'm making a choice out of 7 alternatives. And then she asked the Russians, and the Russians say, this is all one choice. It's just all soda. So her point was that in America, everything is a choice. Like choosing between 200 to 300, breakfast cereals is a choice. And people actually want to make a choice. They want to make a choice about who they marry. They want to make a choice about what profession they pursue. They want to make a choice about like everything. That's not true. And this I saw growing up in India, and I don't know where Brazil falls on the spectrum, which is that people are quite happy to have others make a choice for them. It's not necessary that, that it's just the choice that people make. And the other point I found very interesting is this idea of analytical versus holistic reasoning. All this is in the paper, so I'm not going to go over it a great deal. But this idea that, if you ask Americans, if you show them a fish tank and you ask them to describe the scene, they will describe the fish in a lot of detail. And if you ask the Japanese, they will describe the water and the plants. So they will describe the context more than the figure in the. And actually, when you change the context, the Japanese can't actually, and East Asians often will not remember the individual figure, okay, because the figure is only in context. So this idea of holistic versus analytical, which is very much based on, that individual fish. So that's and you can see that I didn't know that this existed, but as soon as I saw it, I was like, of course, that's the way that, we think about in India. And a fourth one, which actually my professor, like I said, Paul Rosen told me, is about moral reasoning. So in the US, for example, there's the way that people talk about morality is fairness and justice and individual harm. Okay, so people will talk about whether something is fair or just. In countries like India and in many other non-Western societies, there's also a notion of purity, which is part of morality. So people have a lot of habits around food, even if it doesn't harm anyone, that the purity of the food, and also community. So community is a big part of morality. So it's not just about you wanting, so doing your duty, for example, is like really, really big in places like India, even if that is not the best thing for you as a person. And my psychology professor famously said, if I had grown up in India, I would have had a completely different view of morality than growing up in the US. So I think there are all these differences which are fascinating, and you can read more about them in the paper. So I'll just talk about a couple of the differences that, and then they make some other comparisons. So it turns out even Americans versus other Western populations are different. And it turns out that American undergrads versus the American population is different. So as you can well tell, most of the psychology studies that use American undergrads are probably the least representative population that you can actually find. So I want to tell you a story of, maybe I'll stop share so that I can see your faces. I want to tell you a story when I went to India. So I was at Pepsi, and we were doing some focus group discussions, and we were trying to understand people's snacking habits. And people were talking, and they were talking in Hindi. They were talking in Hindi, and I can understand Hindi, except that every time they had to talk about, say, potato chips or something, they would say junk food, and they would say that in English. So I turned to the person next to me, and these were very low income people, like they don't normally speak English. So I turned to the person next to me and said, what is the word for junk food in Hindi? And she said, and she thought, and she said, actually, there isn't such a word. Because in India, unless the food is actually rotten, all food is good, right? There is no such thing as junk food or bad food. It's just all good food. So people have no way of saying this food is good or this food is bad. And actually, that's what Paul Rosen shows when he looks at food. Americans have a uniquely sort of moral way of looking about food, good food, bad food. Whereas in many cultures, including France, etc., people just say tasty food or not tasty. Like there is no such thing as this is bad for me. And another example is when we were trying to translate something and we were saying, do you feel guilty eating this? And in India, at least in Hindi, the term for guilt is very much like a criminal term, which is, you know, like, have you committed a crime? There is no word for I feel guilt. So this idea of guilty pleasures, there is no Hindi word for that idea of guilty pleasures. Like there literally doesn't exist. And people would be like, you know, they just can't translate it. So it was a really good wake-up call to me that even something that we think about is so universal. In the US all the time, we say, oh, it's my guilty pleasure, or oh, I feel guilty about it. Is like, it was quite shocking to see that like it just doesn't exist. Or junk food, you know, people are like, what is junk food? And so they'll use the English. I'm sure it probably happens even in Brazil. Like they'll use the English to actually to tell you about that. And another example I saw just a couple of days ago in a tweet. So in Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, he says, you know, we have a limited budget of attention, and it's no coincidence that in the English language, you say to pay attention. That means you're actually paying attention and you're expending the budget. And he said, you know, this shows that attention is a limited resource, except that that is only true of English. In most languages, you don't say pay attention, you say give attention, you say attend attention. So he was making, and this is, you know, the best psychologist in the world is sort of making, and Elina Halonen actually, she sort of said that, and, you know, let me see if I can just share that tweet. She actually said that, and she said that there is, oops, I don't know. Hang on 1 minute. This Zoom, unfortunately, one has to go back and forth between sharing slides. So she actually said, if you can see it, I'll just read it out. She said, this is a good example of potential problems arising from Anglocentricity of behavior science. In Finnish, you say attach attention. In French, you say make attention. In Italian, you say lend attention. In Spanish, it's give attention. In Swedish, it's be attentive, which sounds much less. So you're not saying, you know, that it's you pay attention. So there's no limited budget of attention that you're disposing of. I don't know. What do you say in Portuguese for pay attention? What's the literal translation?
It's sort of like prestar atenção is kind of like serve attention. Yeah, it's the lines of giving and
correct. So it's not like, even in Hindi, I was thinking, it made me think, and I was thinking about the languages I know, and there's nothing that says pay attention is a very English way of saying something, and it's literally like pay attention. And you know, so that's why it's so fascinating to me that you should always try and translate a concept into multiple languages. And for me, actually, the biggest difficulty is I can't translate nudge into any Indian language. There is no word for nudge. I don't know whether it exists in Portuguese. It does not exist in the Indian languages.
We've spent, like, this has been really challenging to figure out what word should we use here, because nudge, if you have never heard the concept, it's a really weird word, but translated here would be like a gentle push, and exactly. Nothing like works.
Exactly. So similarly in India, I mean, there is if I told people this is a nudge, they would immediately recognize it, but there's no word for it. I mean, there is no easy word for it. Let me put it that way. There could be. And actually the difficulty we found, there isn't even really a good local language word for behavioral science. You know, so even if you were to say behavioral science or behavioral economics, it's not real, like it's really hard. So many of these concepts, self-esteem, and, you know, many of these terms are all English terms. It's really hard to translate some of these terms in Indian languages. And that's why I think it's very useful to try and do it, because I always ask people, what do you say in your language? And if people struggle, then you know that concept actually is not as robust. And you know, particularly for those of us who grew up, like there is a formal Hindi, and I'm sure you can find the word in that, or a formal, you know, Tamil or Malayalam. But I typically ask people who speak the language every day, right? And then they'll say, oh, I don't know what the word is. And that's how I figure out, okay, that maybe that's not so universal. And it tells you a lot about, I think, the concept. So, you know, I'd love to know, I don't know, do you have any examples of stuff in Brazilian culture where you think that's so strange that someone would say this, like, you know, like I said, junk food doesn't exist or anything like that. That's sort of such a weird thing. It's such a non-weird thing. I don't know. Do you have examples where you've, I don't know if you can think of it. It'd be fun to think of some things where, you know, typically in terms of food or in terms of community relationships, I find that those are where often you will have that. Like I find it very interesting that, I don't know if it exists in Portuguese, but in India, in most languages, every relative in the family has a particular name. So you can't just say that's my uncle or that's my aunt. Your father's sister is different from your mother's sister. And your father's brother is different from your mother's brother, and it's different from your mother's sister's husband. So it's a very precise language in that sense, which then makes all the relationships extremely precise because they're at slightly different levels of, so I don't know if that is true of, I don't know enough Portuguese to know if that's true of Portuguese, but.
People just shared in the chat, but we also don't have a word for fast food. We use it, fast food.
We just say fast food. We don't have that. There would be no such thing. So I think it's fascinating. I think we should compile a list of words for which there's no equivalent word to actually figure out. And so therefore you can figure out that some of these concepts have been imported, right? So, I mean, it's not like chips don't sell in India, and it's not like all of this food doesn't sell. It's growing very fast, but it's not in the Indian sort of culture. Another very interesting one, I spend a lot of my time in food, so that's a very interesting thing for me, was that in India, you know, if you give somebody a burger or a pizza, they consider it a snack. They don't consider it food. Okay, so even if, because food is rice and lentils, rice and dal. So even, or rotis, which is chapatis, which is like a bread. So even if, like, my father-in-law would go out, he'd have a huge hamburger, and then he'd say, oh, I have to go home and have dinner. I said, but you just had dinner. That was like a huge hamburger. He said, no, that was a heavy snack. So there was this concept of light snacks, which are like chips and so on. And then there's this concept of heavy snacks, but it's not coded as food. So I just think it's really interesting how, and you'll see it a lot in food and in relationships, how different it is. And I think all this is really important because when we're doing behavioral science, it's all about the context, right? So that's why I think it's worth sort of thinking about what words do we study as behavioral scientists that don't actually exist in our culture or in the way that we do things, or how do we do things that way. So that was sort of just getting you, you know, and the question, and you know, the interesting thing is, why does it matter, right? So I think it matters because, you know, what these guys talk about in the paper is actually quite interesting. They say it really does matter, other than, you know, pointing out these examples, because psychology has, and therefore behavioral science is focused a lot on things like fairness and self-concept and, you know, cognitive dissonance and, you know, things about the self. And they have focused much less on things like kinship, community, rituals, you know, all these other things that are so prevalent in the rest of the world. And so it even has, it's not just that it's not replicable with a lot of humanity. It's that the topics we study are influenced by the culture in which that study takes place. So that's why I think, and that I found very interesting, that it's not just that they're saying they're missing out on a lot of the world, how the world behaves, because we study it from an American lens. So I just thought, I don't know what you guys thought about that, but I just thought that was so interesting because, you know, there isn't a lot about community in behavioral science, or about rituals in behavior science, right? Or about kinship, or, you know, ethnicity, not race, but ethnicity and foods and so on. And I don't know whether you felt the same way, or you think, what you thought. What I was just thinking, what could be the other things that are missing because we are studying it from a very American lens?
I think just relating to this last point you mentioned about how the mentality of the researcher shapes what he or she will study the very young discussion about libertarian paternalism and like the ethics of nudge. Like you can see that in the US is a way stronger, they have a way stronger worry about preserving liberty and individual choice.
Exactly.
And in our government in Brazil, we tolerate a lot more of paternalistic interventions. So sometimes when they say, for example, about I don't know, for example, here we have voting mandate, and it's mandatory, or for example, smoking. So we cannot smoke in public places, public closed places. And yeah, I can remember right now, but a lot of examples that people have showed in behavioral science, and I was like, okay, here we just have a mandatory intervention, like a regulation.
That's a great point. I mean, because it does come back. Remember, I talked about moral reasoning. So John Haidt actually, he does say that in Western and among Democrats in the US, the thinking is fairness, justice, liberty. Those are the foundations. Like that's what people think is morality. They actually think freedom is. And his point was that the Republicans and many other non-sort of Democrat societies actually have two more dimensions, which is community and which is purity. So actually, your point is exactly right, that, you know, if you ask an American researcher that could we have a nudge that doesn't preserve liberty, they'd be like, oh my God, what are you talking about? This is so bad, right? But I totally get it. In another culture, you might say that, look, if it preserves community or if it preserves security, then, you know, it's fine to do it. Because so I think we should be questioning whether individual liberty and libertarian paternalism is actually the biggest virtue that we should be promoting when nudging, or there are some other virtues. I don't know what the answer is, but it's a really good question. I hadn't thought of it, but you know, it is a good question. If the only foundation is not just liberty and individual freedom, then what else should nudges do if you're preserving social good, right? Like, yeah, very, very cool. So yeah, so you can see that, you know, so read the paper. It's really, I found it quite interesting, and it's really, like I said, it's very, very comprehensive. So they really put together all the research in various dimensions, which really makes you think about, and then there's a whole lot of people after that who have put a commentary on that research. That's why it's like 75 pages, which is almost like reading a book. But I think it's really interesting, and I think we should have more discussions about this. So, you know, so now I'll sort of transition to part two, which was, you know, this was my experience when I went to India. And so in 2017, as I said, I went to India to sort of set up a center for social and behavior change. Let me share my screen. This was a center that was being funded by the G.E.E.C Foundation. And they said, look, we're setting up a center at a newly established, very well-known university. And we want to, the idea of this is to design, advance, and enable evidence-led communication interventions for low-income and marginalized populations. I was in New York at that time. I said, do I have to relocate to India? So I had been to India every year. My parents are in India, etc. My husband's parents are there too, but hadn't worked in India for like 15 years at that point. And they said yes. So then we packed bag and baggage and we went to India, and I went to set up the center. And so just to give you context, I don't know how many people have been to India. It's 1.3 billion people. So one of the states is Uttar Pradesh. I think it's the largest state. It's got the population of Brazil, 200 million, and there are 29 states in India. So that's just one state in India. As per the Indian constitution, there are 22 main languages, but there are many, many, many more languages. So every time, so we worked very closely with the Ministry of Health, and every time we had to develop a TV commercial, a radio commercial, a poster, we had to do it in 18 languages. They would be like, this is great. So we would do it in English or Hindi. And then they'd be, now we want you to translate that into 18 languages. As you can tell, it was a nightmare. We had to dub like TV commercials in 18 languages for the government of India. And they wanted it in all 22. And we said, no, we can't do 22, we'll do 18. There are about 70% of India is rural, and they are in 650,000 villages. So next time you read a paper in India where they say we did this across 20 villages, just remember there are 650,000 villages. So it's like the scale of the country is huge. And what's really surprising is that for this scale of country, behavior science is not, there was not when I went in 2017, actually, there was one firm that was doing behavior science work, and that was it. And nobody else is really doing much of behavior science at all. And it has a very strong English speaking population. Many people go abroad, but somehow it had not taken root in India. So at the center, we were working on, like I said, designing interventions for low income and marginalized populations in public health and financial inclusion. So one of the big problems in India is, one of the big problems in India is anemia. And it's, I've been anemic all my life. I think almost all Indian women are anemic. And I never thought it was a big problem, but it turns out to be a huge problem if you're poor, because it can lead to a very low birth weight for the baby. And it can lead to problems, and it contributes to almost 20% of maternal mortality in India. So it is a huge problem. And the government had started this, end anemia program, like a 5 or 7 year program, the Ministry of Health, and they asked us to help them with that. And it turns out that anemia is it's got multiple causes. And one of those is, and multiple solutions, therefore. So there's diet, there's sanitation, etc. One of the solutions is that there is a free iron tablet that pregnant women are supposed to take for all of their pregnancy. You have to take one tablet every day. And it's given free by the government of India, and it can help to significantly prevent anemia in pregnancy. And then they're supposed to take it for about 6 months after the baby is born. And the government routinely does this they track some of this stuff. And what they found was that self-reported compliance, so this is just women saying that they had taken the pill, not that they had actually taken it, we don't know that, was as low sometimes as 11% in some of the states in India, and was around 30%. So huge gap between maybe intent and action. So they said, why don't you help us to design some communication around this? So we actually did a lot of research, and a lot of people had done research which we used, and we created one TV commercial. But we said, look, this problem is not a problem just of information. It's also a problem of action. So we want to design some behavioral interventions. So they said, great. So my problem was that I said, look, we don't know how to do this on the field. We've never run experiments before. We were just starting the center. So my first thought was that I would call, say, the behavioral insights team, or I would call, one of those people and say, help me to set up a sort of quote unquote nudge unit in India. But when I thought about it, I was like, look, these people work in a situation in which there's a lot of data and a lot of resources and a lot of money. I don't know whether they would be able to come to India where there's no money. We have to go to rural areas, collect information from people who are not even literate half the time. And it's just going to be really hard. So I Googled and I Googled behavioral economics developing countries, and I came across Busara. And Busara Center for Behavioral Economics, they're based in Africa and Kenya. And they've done a lot of work with low income and marginalized populations. And they've done some work in Nigeria and Kenya. So I said, okay, this is much better than, I actually Googled even for LATAM, but I couldn't find at that point anyone. So, there was just Busara. So I said, okay, this is great, because at least they've done work with very low resource settings, very low income consumers. So we started this project to understand what behavioral interventions we could do with anemia. So I'll just share my screen for a few minutes to run you through that project. And then I can tell you some of the learnings from doing this kind of work. So we entered into this agreement with them. And the whole idea was what can you do to improve adherence to iron and folic acid supplements for pregnant women? And they get this from the community health worker, and it's free of cost. So we found that there were multiple barriers for women to do this, multiple. So we picked, 5 of the main, or 3 or 4 of the main barriers. So the one barrier, so, I know you guys have done some of the COMBI frameworks. We actually use the COMBI framework, motivation, opportunity, motivation, ability, opportunity framework. So motivationally, there were 2 or 3 things that were happening. One is that people thought anemia was, they said, look, I'm anemic, but don't worry, I eat enough of spinach every day. And so they didn't really want to have the pill, because it turns out the pill is not that great, actually. It has a lot of side effects. So they said, look, I'm having enough greens every day. I'm having enough milk. They actually thought apples and pomegranates because anemia is seen as a blood problem, and they thought red foods would actually make the anemia go away. So they would say apples and pomegranates are really good for you. And so one of the things was to convince them that the amount of iron that you get in a small pill, you would have to consume a lot of spinach in order to actually have the same effect. So we created some posters around that. A second thing we thought which would be quite motivating is for people to hear testimonials from other people about how anemia survivors, about how they took the pill and they, the anemia was, they prevented it, they had a healthy baby, etc. Especially if it came from the health worker. So those are the motivational things that around motivation. Then one of the things we realized is that taking the pill has a lot of side effects. Nausea and a lot of reported side effects, nausea and the stools turn black and all of that. So what happens is people, when they get these side effects, they're very uncomfortable and also they're scary if people don't know them. So they stop taking the pill. So they take the pill for the first day, the pregnant women, then the side effects start and then they just stop taking the pill. So we wanted to find a really easy way to tell women that please expect these side effects. That means the pill is working. And also a way to help them to manage the side effects. So, basically if you take it at night, then it's a really good way that you can then go to sleep so you don't have nausea. Then we sort of look back on our behavioral economics. This is not what people told us, the last two, but what we thought, which is that we know in behavioral economics with pill adherence, one of the biggest problems is people just forget. They just forget, right? Now, they never told us this at all. This was one of those things we had to understand from the literature because no one is going to say, I just forgot to take the pill. But we thought, okay, what are some motivating ways for them to make sure that they take the pill? And one of those is goal progress. As human beings, I'm sure you've seen the goal progress work. We like to make progress. And if we see ourselves making progress, we are more likely to be able to stick to a behavior. So we created a little calendar and they could peel off every day as they were taking the pill. And there was a cute little picture of a baby. And that was a way to do it. And then we also thought we'd do a little bit of a nice reminder to the mothers. And in order to make it, if you're calling them every day to say, take the pill, eventually they're just not going to pick up the phone. So we thought we'd make it in the form of a mini sort of entertainment education. We'd give them a mini story so that, they'll be interested. And then at the end of it, say, please take the phone. So like I said, two were to do with motivation, equivalence, and testimonial. One was to do with ability, manage side effects, which is counseling. And two had to do with opportunity, which is goal progress and doing that. So we tested them. I won't run through this slide, but basically we tested them in a rural part in one of the states. I'll show you how we tested them. We also, Google at that point was running, is still running. They want to increase technology in villages in India. So they have this thing called Internet Saathi or Internet Friend, where they have these women go out with laptops and tablets to show other women in villages how to use technology, okay, how to use Google, etc. So these women who have the tablets, obviously they're already going out to other women and they're looking at other sources of income. So we said, okay, why don't we have them also run some of our experiments? So some of as you can see, some of the experiments, we loaded up the testimonial video on these Internet Saathis tablets and we sent them. And some of them we did. So in general, we had about 300 per cell. So this is not a huge RCT. This is like a mini RCT, because at this point we just wanted to see which of these 5 things works, if any, and what can we learn. So this is almost at a design stage where we wanted to run these kinds of mini experiments, and that's why the sample size is not huge at all. And you can see the outcome here, which is how comprehension or recall. So you can't actually in a small scale experiment test if people are taking the pill, because you would need to monitor them for 30 days to make sure there is adherence. So we had to do all these proxy outcomes to make sure that people were actually taking, that we could say this intervention is working. This was one of the things we did. So, we had to go to rural Haryana to the villages. And so when Busara came, the first thing they did was they tried to go to the community center or to the school to set up a lab, a fixed lab. because that's what they've done in Kenya. But it turns out in India, one, there is no such thing as a community center. There are actually early childhood education centers, but mostly there is no such thing as a place where people come. And also the electricity is very varying in Indian villages. So we said, okay, that won't work because half the time the computers will go out. So then what we did is we took a bus and we retrofitted the bus. We outfitted it with 20 seats and computers. So it's like a mobile lab. And then that bus went into all the villages in Haryana. So we would have research assistants on the bus. They would go to the village. They would take the permission of the village, the head of the village, and then they would run these experiments. People would come into the bus. They would do it and go. And that was what actually worked. And it was quite interesting to actually, put this into motion. And it turned out that it wasn't that expensive to hire the bus. But we also had a lot of difficulties about running the bus and so on and so forth. So anyway, so I won't go through each experiment. I just want to talk a little bit about the learnings in applying behavior science in, in a real world context in the global south. So the first thing is that 2 out of our 5 experiments, even at this stage, really gave us positive results, which was the counseling card and the calendar. Those two actually, they were quite promising. The interesting one is that this food equivalent one, this one where, we tell people this is equivalent to spinach. People just didn't understand it. They did not get the relationship. So they thought that they valued the IFA pill, the iron pill, more when we tell them that it's equivalent to like 5 kilos of spinach. But they don't get that that's because of the iron content. Like it just doesn't, like they don't understand that anemia is an iron problem. Okay, they just think it's because you have less blood. So in India, they literally call it less blood. That's the way they describe it. So they just didn't understand. The testimonial, it didn't turn out to be very motivating for them. And the IVRS was interesting. And this is a good example of why, it's so hard to run experiments, is we thought it was like a fabulous idea. It was really hard to execute. And there was no difference. And we dropped it in the end because it was just too difficult to actually take out this idea or to execute the idea. So 2 of the experiments worked, and Busara has done quite a bit of work in Africa. They put up a lot of case studies on their website, and you'll see that that's about the success rate at this early stage. I would be shocked if it's more than 30-40%, and that's very high. So that's one thing we learned, that every time the academics write papers and they say, oh, we got this thing, they probably have 50 other experiments that haven't worked. At least that's my understanding, because, we thought all of these would work really well and some of them just didn't work. As I said, there were logistical issues with running the intervention. So, when you try and make it very complicated, even though it's a brilliant intervention, it's just really hard to run. And so you have to really just do the simple things. I told you about the food equivalents. Like we were so even when we were running the experiments, we are all highly educated English speaking folks. It was so normal for us to think that, of course, people have to understand that iron is there. And it was just, some of these things you understand only when you run the experiment. So now I'd be much more careful about making these kinds of assumptions. It took us a long time. So it took us, we thought we could run these experiments start to finish, from the time we get the idea to prototyping, to designing, analyzing, running the experiment. We thought, okay, maximum maybe 2 months, 3 months. It took us like close to 7 or 8 months. Because actually the actual data collection took only 2 weeks, but really because there were so many logistical issues. I mean, I can't tell you how many, including like the university can't pay out cash, right? Because they can't account for it. But you have to pay participants, and participants are not going to take checks. So what do? The bus didn't have a license to go to another state. So we could only do experiments in a particular state. Just everything, like we had to take permission from the local leaders to run the experiments. And there were only certain times, like when people would, so we couldn't do it the whole day. So there was actually only a block of 3 or 4 hours where we could run the experiment. So, everything took us at least 3 or 4 times longer than we thought. So the first time, and then it becomes better, and then it becomes better. I think we use some scales, but, I don't know whether those were the, I don't know whether those are the right scales. I think that, it's still a matter of trying to figure out if it's the right scales to use. When you say trust, do people understand what it means to trust? And I think that in retrospect, looking back, we would have probably had more qualitative research, not just the quantitative, because I think when we got some of the results back, we were asking ourselves, oh, why did we get this? And then we're like, we should have just asked people. So after that, when we ran some work, we built in a lot of like qualitative as well, because sometimes, you know, so again, my experience from running work in the US with US undergrads, where the system is very optimized, and B, reading academic papers, and you see these lovely, very clean, very nice experiments, and actually doing it in the field was completely different. And if you're doing non-digital work, it's like a completely different story altogether. I mean, digital is still easier. Non-digital work is almost impossible. It is so hard to do a single experiment. So I just want to say that if you're having difficulty running experiments, that is normal. So, you should actually you should expect that your experiment will take 6 months the first time. Then as you start to get better at it, maybe the cycle time can reduce. But if you're running something for the first time, you're almost never going to get it done less than that, no matter what you think. And then you have to make so many changes. So when we scaled up the experiment from, this was a controlled environment, it still took us 7 or 8 months, to we then scaled it up. We found that actually in that scaled environment, we couldn't go with, so the health workers had been delivering the intervention. In the scaled environment, we actually couldn't have the health workers deliver the intervention. And that was a massive change that we actually had to make in the scaled up version. So it's just especially, I think it's really important for us to have the South-South collaboration when we are trying to figure out how to make things happen. Because I think that if we had just relied on what we read in this or the presentations made by nudge units, etc., it feels so simple. Oh, like you send one email out, everybody does everything. And in reality, it is much more messy than what we had to. So I'll stop there. I know I've already spoken for an hour. I thought I'd speak for much less. I did have one final section, but actually you can read about it. Flora, I sent that link about Busara doing just to give you a teaser of that, what we thought would be really cool to do is to replicate some of the best known biases in India. So like the representativeness heuristic, right? Linda is a bank teller, or all of these anchoring effects, or like all of these things, right? The decoy effect in choice. And we selected about 10 of those, and we thought it would be fun to replicate them and actually see if they exist in India. So I can, through Flora, I can put you in touch with Nick Owsley at Busara, because he just presented some of that work, and it'd be fun to actually, I don't know if you've replicated it, but it'd be really nice to see. And we did find actually that it is harder than you think. I mean, it's not necessary that you take something and it works. You'll see in the article there to contextualize like the stimulus a lot to make people understand. So sometimes when things don't replicate, you have to ask the question is it about the stimulus, or is it about the actual psychological mechanism? And sometimes, you don't get it right on the first try. So I'll leave that for you to read, but I'd love to throw it open for a discussion and ask me anything, I guess, at this point.
Neela, thank you so much for your talk. I wanted to jump into just because like every point you mentioned, I can totally relate to some of the challenges you said, and specifically about when you talked about how was the process of implementing the intervention. So yeah, I totally felt that. For example, when we read academic papers that are telling about an experiment, they never show you the operational issues and everything that you've had to go through. And Taina works with me in the City Hall, but like every experiment, we have a power issue because some part of the population did not get in contact, or sometimes we use like the telephone center, an operational telephone center, and then you have to train the operators. So yeah, this is really
the schedule
more.
And the schedule is always longer than planned.
Yeah, no, I don't think we talk enough about this, so I'm very careful to say that, look, this sounds great, but let me tell you that, when I first got it, I was quite disappointed. I was like, this is it? Like, This is all the work and that's all, like, where's our fancy paper? But now I'm beginning to realize, and the other lesson I think I realized was that the simpler you do it, the better, even if it's boring. So very often we want to do some really cool work, some really cute stuff, etc. But sometimes it's as simple as saying, can I just make this simpler? You know, so the intervention that worked best was like, there's nothing to it. This counseling card anyone could have thought of, but no one had thought of it. And, you know, that really worked well. So I do think, and, you know, my colleague who's there, Pooja, will tell you that now when they're working with the government, the other big learning for us, especially when working with the government, is you've got to figure out what fits in their planning cycle. So, you know, it's really hard to just have some cool idea, because if they don't have the system to make it work, if they don't have, it'll just get thrown out. So, you know, you have to figure out, is it in their budget? Do they have, who's going to deliver this intervention? Does that person actually, can that person deliver this intervention? And so that throws out a lot of like really cool academic papers that you just can't do because the system doesn't allow for it. And so now what they're saying is that optimization is better than trying something completely new. So you start with something the government or whoever the client is already doing, and then you say, can I make it better using behavior science, rather than say, I'm going to do this whole new thing, you know, because then that's a lot of persuasion that you have to do this whole new thing. So if the government already has a poster, you might say, okay, let me try and optimize this. And by the way, and this is what we did. So we would go like, let us optimize this. And by the way, are you sure that the poster is the right thing? Would you like to try, you know, this other intervention? And then they were more open to that versus us saying, no, let's do a full, let's do this full like research and see what people like and so on. So, yeah.
So,
I'm sorry.
No, but please, Gabriela. You may.
I have a question. I haven't read your article yet, but I will. I actually have a question related to morality. I have been reading up on intrinsic morality, morality that's wired to our brains rather than socialized. And I've been wondering, what's your view on this issue? Do you believe in that? Have you read upon it?
No, I don't know too much about morality, so I'll feel very bad to give you any wrong information. But I think from what little I've read on moral reasoning, the work that John Haidt does, etc., they would actually say it's probably some combination of like, it is socialized to a large extent. So I'm not sure that there is I mean, I think that in most societies we consider, you know, murdering other people maybe not such a great thing, but I don't even know even that. I would be very loath to say that, or very hesitant to say that that's an absolute morality standard, because, you know, there are sacrifices, there are other reasons that it might happen. So I'm more on the side of, I think it's socialized, but yeah, but I would love to hear more about
that. Neela, well, thank you so much for your talk. I mean, having a prior private sector experience, how would you compare the difference in experiences in terms of making an intervention and trying to get results in that context that you are and what you did before, and how and what can the third sector or even behavioral science as a whole learn from the private sector, which tends to be much more pragmatic on the implementation of measures?
So I think you're right. The private sector does. I worked in Pepsi, was setting up a nudge unit there, so I have direct experience comparing the two. I think to that extent, you know, because the private sector is driven by profit, if you can show them that this will make a change to your business, they're okay to do it. I think a lot of the questions, and that's not really, I don't know how transferable it is, but they have more freedom, because the whole ethics of, you know, behavior science and libertarian paternalism, I think, is much more in the public sector. Although I have to say that when I was at PepsiCo, I mean, there was a lot of discussion on using behavior science and how we're using it, and whether we're using it for good or whether we're using it, you know, to encourage consumption of, you know, the the products that were less good for people, etc. So there was actually a lot of discussion about the ethics of behavior science. One thing I have to say in common was that this idea that I said about make sure it's in the planning cycle. So I'll give you an example. We were running some experiments, and so the biggest challenge is, the challenge is never the insight. That people are quite happy, they do the research, and then the challenge is when you tell them, okay, now let's run an experiment. Oh my God, then it's like almost impossible. Everyone becomes risk averse. As much as you say fail fast, blah, 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 no one listens to you. At that point, they're like, but will it work? I'm like, I don't know. That's why we're running this experiment, right? So we ran this, we were trying to understand the impact of categorization. If you categorize things in one way, arrange things on the shelf in one way versus the other. So first, actually, which was pretty easy, we did it digitally. So I worked with a design center. Pepsi had a nice design center, and they actually created a mock-up of a shelf, and we showed it to people, and we got the responses. And it was quite interesting. And we showed that if you categorize things as per goals versus as per the category, like beverages, snacks, then you actually get more purchase intent. So that was quite interesting. So we said, okay, now can we do it in the real world? How do we do it? So we tried e-com to work with, say, Amazon or something, but they said, we won't share data with you. So we said, okay, that option is out. We can't test that. Then we went to retail. Like the Walmart and the Tesco's, and they also were very wary. And so we said, okay, that's going to be really hard. Then it turns out that, Pepsi has vending machines. So we said, why don't we just rearrange things in the vending machine and actually try and do that? And we were, doing it at university, and we said, let's just change the vending machines in the university. This should be pretty easy, right? And then we can do all sorts of experiments. Well, it turned out it wasn't so easy, because rightly so, the vending machine person in charge, the salesperson, said, what if I lose sales, okay, from your experiment? Then who will compensate me for the lost sales? Because that's my goal, that's my target. And we were like, yeah, that's right. And so that went into a whole loop. Then we finally got something arranged, and we said, okay, if this happens, we'll compensate something. It turns out that vending is subcontracted, right? Then we set up the vending machines. And on day one, like, we go to look at the experiment, and the whole machine. And so one of our experiments is actually about location. Does location matter? So it was important to set up the machines in that place. We go to the university, and the guy has changed the vending machine location. We're like, what happened? He's like, no, this wasn't working. So I changed the location. So, the logistical difficulties, the difficulties of implementation in an offline environment. I think where it's worked in private sector really well is tech companies, and companies where there's an online environment, right? CPG companies, consumer packaged goods companies, FMCGs, it's much harder, because trying to set up experiments. So then we had actually thought of having a partnership with one of the big retailers and asking them to give us a couple of stores to experiment with as part of a long-term partnership. And then when that sort of was happening, I left the company. But I think that's the problem I see with putting behavior science work in organizations. So, now where there's an interesting idea about behaviorally informed interventions versus actual interventions, right? And so we're saying, even if you can get the organization to think behaviorally and to actually have some behaviorally informed interventions, even if you can't really test them out in an experiment, let's at least get to that level. Versus, and the same thing with government, versus like trying to test out everything, because I think the biggest barrier is just experimentation. Like, it's in the private sector, it's more like revenue risk. In the public sector, it's more like all these other risks around experimentation, but that has been the common sort of block in both private and public sectors.
Neela, hi. Thanks again for your presentation. It was excellent. I have more of loose thoughts than a question. I would like to go back to the difference between weird and no weird population regarding the dimension of trust, because Western people tend to be more individualistic, think less of a community. And here in Brazil, I have a lot of friends from other countries, and they say the Brazilians have trust issues, and I really agree with them. and I watched some Dan Ariely talks about trust, and especially now with the coronavirus pandemic, we're talking about the tragedy of the commons and the role of trust. And I wonder what would be the difference. Now we're facing some huge vaccination campaigns for coronavirus, and we have already anti-vax people with issues of who is producing, which country is producing the vaccine, and it's clearly it's a trust issue. I won't enter the discussion if it's silly or not, but it's a trust issue. And I would like to hear from you. What do you think about what would be the difference between weird people and no weird people, weird countries and no weird countries, related to this trust issues, especially on this vaccination?
I think it's a huge unexplored area. So we have some thoughts on that coming very soon. And it is a big unexplored area. And I'm not sure what the answer, but there are a couple of interesting things. I think the trust I think there is trust, but at different levels in between weird and non-weird populations. So I think and that's primarily because of the institutions. Right. So most often you can't tell because it's confounded by the fact that most of the global south and most of the non-weird countries don't have very strong institutions. Right. So that's the problem. So, in countries like India, I'm sure it's true of Brazil, you might have higher trust within your community, but you don't often have that level of trust with, say, a local government or a national government. And similarly, not the way that in the US. So in the US, for example, you have very high trust with the local government or national government. And that's really interesting because, we were doing some work in Africa and in some countries in Africa. And in the US and in the UK, one of the things they said, stay at home to protect healthcare workers, right? To protect doctors. And doctors enjoy a very high level of trust. Now, in some countries, people think doctors are just out to make money. So they don't have that level of trust that people have in doctors here. And so, that is not going to work there if you say, hey, stay at home to protect the healthcare workers. They're like, no, they're the ones who are doing this so they can make money. So, I'm not going to trust them. So I think that we need to do much more work around trust. I have a feeling it has to do with how weak the institutions are. And you're totally right. So in India, for example, there's pretty strong routine immunization, but there are certain groups. So the problem isn't that immunization, even routine childhood immunization, the problem isn't so much that it's not covered, but there are certain groups, the most marginalized in the caste system, the Dalits, Muslims, for example, who don't get vaccinated, and it's totally a lack of trust. What's really interesting is that Surgo Foundation, that I do some consulting for, they did some work around social distancing in the US, and a similar issue came up with the Black population, where they felt like they didn't trust the local government enough. And I think the key in this one, the key for vaccination was actually getting the involvement of local or community leaders, religious leaders often, to get people to do this. So I have a feeling that, you may not be able to just rely only on local government or federal government to do something. And there have to be more active participation of religious and local leaders. And I think this is one place where, again, like I said, South can really make a difference. So I would love to see what Brazil is doing, because I think we could get a lot more there in India than trying to take what's been done in the US to India, for example. So definitely, I think it's a huge issue. And I think there's trust in government. There's who do you trust, what members of your community. And, in the end, I might do something, but depending on who I trust is telling me what to do. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, this is one of those areas I think we should do more work on. I totally think.
You.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, the trust and reputation works together. So
it's totally, like when I was working in the private sector, it's very interesting. They said this in terms of branding. So in the US, you have different brands for different things, right? So a toothpaste brand will be Colgate, and a light switch brand will be something else. In India and in South Korea, with the big business houses, like the most successful toothpaste was actually guys who had made a light bulb brand. Okay, and then they went into toothpaste. I mean, there's no reason that someone would think that if you're good at making light bulbs, you should be good at making toothpaste, right? And but that's true. But the underlying thing was reputation and trust. Like, if these guys make one thing well, they'll make another thing well. Whereas in the US, you think about individual brand attributes. Like Colgate, you will never trust Colgate to make electricity, you know, because you think about Colgate as toothpaste. So it's very interesting. And I don't think there's enough been studied about that. But it's true in a lot of Asia, where you have these large industrial houses who will make everything from cars to like cosmetics to, you know, to everything. You don't have that. Ford doesn't make, you know, moisturizing cream, but you have that in South Korea. And so I think it's also the level at what level people trust and what they trust particular things for.
Thank you. Flora, you raised your hand.
So Neela, I was just thinking how the importance of non-weird applications in behavioral interventions in public sector social policies directly affects some challenges that a practitioner faces. So the first one is when defining the agenda and what challenges we'll work on. I remember that when I started working with the health department, a lot of experiments came from the US, which has a different, really different health system structure than us. So most of the experiments happen in just 1 or 2 hospitals or health clinics, and it didn't really help how to think about, for example, immunization policy for the whole city or big public health challenges like that. So I think it really impacts how what challenge we will start.
Yeah. India has a very strong primary healthcare. Well, it has a primary healthcare infrastructure. It's not currently super strong, but it exists, right? And hospitals are a very, very, very small percentage. And actually, one of the people that has made this argument that to tackle COVID, actually you can't send people to hospitals. You've got to tackle it at the primary healthcare centers, because there aren't enough, forget hospital beds. There's no, you know, people can't even reach there, etc. And so, but that doesn't exist in the US because you have only hospitals. You don't really have primary healthcare centers, except in some parts of the US. So I totally agree with you. And I think this is where learning from other countries that have similar systems is probably better than learning from just the Western European countries, which are very different from a lot of the countries that like we work in.
And then the second point related to it is actually when we develop the solution. So first, what works varies among contexts. So as we saw in the experiments, not only only at all times people don't have a bias depending on the culture or something like that, but also depending on the context that you elicit this bias, this may not happen. So sometimes social norms might not work to tax collection, and when we advocate for the area, we tend to make really strong generalizations and affirmations that may affect what we test. But the second point that got me thinking is we may have the concept, like universal concepts, but we vary on how to actually materialize this concept in terms of a letter or a material or a communication piece. And this I don't follow a lot of discussion on that topics, and I was wondering, is it best to do it really context adequate, or would it be best thinking about the evolution of the field to do a replication of a same letter, for example, to see what works in what context and what does not? What do you think about this trade-off?
It's a good point, and I think it comes down to what your goal is. So I think if you were academic, then they would say that you should sort of keep it as rigorous as possible. You're testing only one small thing. If you talk to practitioners, even in the US, they'll tell you that you can't just vary one word in a letter and send it out and expect to get a huge result, right? You'll get something like, and this is the other problem is between practice and research is, there was this recent paper by Stefano Della Vigna and Elizabeth Linos, and they showed that the average effect, they excluded defaults, but in general of nudges was about 1% change. If I went to the government of India or anybody else and said, hey, I'm going to do this thing, it's going to give you 1% change, they'll throw me out of there, right? They're not going to, they're not all this stuff just for 1%. Now, the argument for that is that, well, 1% makes a difference and it's no cost by changing one line in a letter. If you can, you were anyway going to send the letter out if you can. So I think given all that, I would be on the side of, for a practitioner, on the side of one, use existing platforms, right? So the government is anyway sending out a letter, then you might as well use that to test and see if you can make it better. And that's what I meant by optimizing rather than trying something completely new, right? Because when we tried IVRS, the voice recognition thing, we couldn't make it work because we were trying to set up an entire system from scratch. So the counseling card, again, we were trying to make it very tech heavy and, it didn't work. So we went with the simplest possible, like physical card, etc. So I think that in that context, I would say use a platform that actually works. And so for this, if you're working with government or even with private sector clients, by the way, this is not only restricted to government. It's like you first need to understand, what are you actually doing? What are your communication channels? What are your intervention channels? And if they're doing something, then it's much easier to say, okay, I'll use that to optimize something. The second lesson that I found is you might want to put in 2 or 3 different interventions into one pilot. Because like just changing like one line of social norms may not do that. So you might say, I'm going to put social norm, but I'm also going to put a reminder and I'm also going to do this. And that's going to be one treatment. And the other treatment is I'm going to do none of these things, right? And it's not clean. You can't get what's the exact effect of social norms versus this, but it's more practical. Because you'll at least know that if I put in this bundle, this seems to work versus not seems to. So that's another way of thinking about it, right? Rather than think about, okay, unless you can run A/B experiments digitally really quickly and effectively, the setup time especially to run offline things is so high that you might want to combine a couple of things rather than just try one thing. And it will never get you published anywhere, but I think it will still get to better outcomes than just doing that. But yeah, I agree with you that even something as robust as social norms doesn't work the way that you think it's going to work. It just doesn't. And that's the difficulty. I'll be really, I'm sorry I'm being such a downer, but I still think there's a lot of promise in behavior science. I think the difficulty is everybody's so dazzled by it that they think you're going to come in with something like social norms and it's going to change everything from 30% to 60% compliance just by changing one line. And then they get very disillusioned when they see that the effects are very small or, whatever. So it's just managing expectations, I think. And that's really hard to do. I mean, I don't, you have to constantly just keep managing those expectations. So I don't know if I answered your question, but it's good. I mean, I don't know the answer to many of these things. It's good to think about these.
Yes, thank you. Does anyone have any further questions?
Sorry. Someone have a question?
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to end, but I'll take whatever question. I had a couple of things just to say in terms of what I would love to see from the Brazilian group, but I think I'll take the question and then I can sort of wrap up.
Go ahead, Leonardo.
Okay. When you said about trust and the difference.
Sorry, I can't hear you.
You can hear me
really...
now? It's really? Okay. One moment. One moment.
No.
Nothing.
No, we can hear.
Tá bem baixo.
Maybe you can type it out in the chat.
Yeah.
Tenta de novo, Leonardo. Você estava mutado.
Deixa eu ver aqui. Vamos ver.
Acho que melhorou um pouco.
Melhorou.
Melhorou agora?
Yeah.
You can hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Perfect. You, Arthur, brought the trust issue and the common things among the South Global countries, and you said it the experiment in India that the problem was information. Yes, people know those things. So the strategy that you use was to angle more motivation. The pregnant had the calendar and had other strategies. There is it's possible to use to find or to see some kind of correlation between
government trust in the type of the strategies to use, the type of models to use, because if the problem is information, technically, the government will bring information.
Yes.
But depending the level of trust, it will use or not. I don't know if there is possible to see some kind of correlation between the level of trust and the kind of intervention.
That's a great one. I hadn't thought of it, but I think it's really important. I don't think there's been any study of that, but I think it's something that could be super important. And you're totally right. What the government does best is scale. And what they can scale really well is information. Right?
Yes.
And information does work. By the way, for all of the studies, we keep saying behavior science, information alone doesn't work. There have been lots of studies where information does work. If people can act on the information and it's simple, then just giving them information itself is good enough to make it work. And I agree with you that it's a lot of times people disregard the information because they don't trust enough the source of the information. And it would be really interesting to say, does that correlate with some basic trust established by the government? Yeah, I don't know if there's been a lot of work on that one. That would be really interesting to see. Because you could make communication much more effective just by increasing this basic trust, right? And then the question would be, how would you do that? Why don't people trust? Why is there a difference in the Western world and in the and so in India, what we're seeing now with coronavirus is there is a lot of, I don't know what the word in Portuguese is, vigilantism. People are on their own, there's actually a lack of trust. So they think that, as soon as someone is suspected of having coronavirus, everybody gangs up and, they try and avoid. It's almost like this person has some fatal, really horrible disease. And because there's such an atmosphere of fear. So how can you even get people to enforce certain behaviors without resorting to that kind of, just punishing people randomly and destroying trust in the system? It's not something that happens as much in the US. So I think this whole idea of trust in government, and therefore how can you increase trust, because that seems to be a major reason for the lack of information effectiveness and other interventions. I think that could be really interesting. I haven't seen anything. I would love to know if there's something out there, but I haven't seen anything really that talks about that.
Yeah, I ask about that because there is a paper from Brazil from economic plan that was made by a president, the color plan, and how the plan make it the culture about saving change, because the moment that plan was used, I am a psychologist, so some things about economics that I lost a little bit, but the plan made that the savings of the people that were in the bank, they couldn't access that money anymore. So yes. After that, what happens is that there is no more saving. There is no saving culture in Brazil.
The same thing in India. So the government of India has opened up a lot of bank accounts. They've been very successful in opening the bank accounts, but people don't access or use the bank accounts because they are not sure whether the money will be there. And it's much safer to keep the money under their pillow or to do things and
just expand it. Just expand and paying credit.
Benefits. Yeah, they know the benefits of saving. They know all of that. It's not like they're not doing that. They want, and they'll actually save informally, but they will not save in a formal system, which is cheaper in the long run. So I think we need to do a lot more work, if you ask me, on how do you develop trust. Like that should be a basic outcome variable in the behavior science work that we do in the global south, which is not, trust is taken for granted in the global north because everything works. And I think we really need more work around that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Neela, I have a final question, if no one wants.
Yeah,
If anyone wants to make a question, just put it in the, just let us know in the chat. But just to conclude all of this, if you could have now the power to restructure or coordinate or organize the behavioral science field in the way you would like to, and to kind of solve this non-weird thing, what would you do in terms of, I don't know, methodology or how the centers are set up? If you could have this
Yes,
power, like.
I mean, and I'd love your thoughts on what we can do, because I think that one of the biggest problems I saw, I don't know if it's true in Brazil, but in India it was true, is that there is no supply of behavior scientists. So the reason that there's so much work in behavior science in the US is that there are at least 100 universities which have labs. You know, the Wharton lab is a very well-funded lab. You can keep running experiments every single day if you want. And so eventually you find interesting things to study. You don't have to so much consider the cost of running things, right? So it's really hard if I am going to go to a country and now I have to figure out how to run my experiment, whom to get, like all that infrastructure. So I think one thing that, and we're trying to do that, and I would love to sort of have more of a say, like how can we get starting with our universities, to actually set up these kinds of labs, even if they're not doing very applied work, even if they're doing it just to, to test out some academic theories, right? Because I find that that's a big problem in India, that people say, I'd love to run this experiment, then they can't run anything, because then they'll have to like hire research assistants, they will have to go out, they'll have to figure out how to do this. Like no one is doing this work for them. And that's what actually we had thought of doing at CSBC, which is to make it that kind of infrastructure that you can then just plug and play. If you're a researcher, you want to do work in India, you don't have to think, you just contact us, we can run that kind of experiment for you. Busara does it a little bit in Kenya and Nigeria. So I think that's one thing that I would really, the problem is funding, right? You have to get like somebody to fund this kind of work, because it's not like donors in the public sector, donors typically fund the work one-on-one, like for a certain project or something, but they won't fund infrastructure. So I wonder if there's a way to convince them to sort of fund this kind of lab infrastructure. The other thing I found was that, and I just recently took a course at Ashoka University, that there is no, at least in India, there's hardly any teaching about behavior science. So people just, they pick up from books and from maybe some online courses, like Dilip Soman has an online course, but that's it. There's no one actually teaching. And now actually with the pandemic, given, how online teaching is, it's not that hard to do. So I really wish that, I would restructure it such that we would get more tie-ups with universities or with professors or with people actually doing that. And then the third one, which I don't know how to do, so this is all a wish list, I don't know whether I would do it, is have more global south, like networking and meetings. So I went for behavioral exchange last year, and it was in London, and it was overwhelmingly like global north. And I was like, why should it be in London? It should be in, it should be in Sao Paulo, it should be in Delhi, it should be in Nairobi. Like, why is it in London, right? So I wish that, again, I think with virtual networks, we can do it. So, and it's a perfect question for what I was going to ask, which is that we should, part of my interest in doing this is to see whether we can set up these networks. So I know India has a behavioral economics network now. I would love to connect you guys to that network, right? Similarly, there are networks in Kenya and in other places. In Middle East, there are some networks. I think, first of all, the first thing we should do is to get connected in those networks, so that we can then start to figure out. And we were planning to have a Global South conference and actually sort of figure out. And now in the virtual world, we can even do it. It's not too hard. Like Nudge Talk did this virtual conference over 3 days. I'm sure we could do one. So if anyone's interested, I'm happy to sort of put together some concept plan and see whether we can get some folks from the India network, from the Africa network, to actually have this kind of thing. And I think that there could be interest in that, even from Global North researchers. So, so I think you really can't do behavioral science, even if you're like me, sitting in Washington, DC, and, and trying to go to India once in a while. I think it has to come from the countries. And even if someone tells you that I'm sitting in London, or I'm sitting in this, and I'm going to come to Brazil and spend 2 months of the year in Brazil, it's not the same thing, right? You can't do it that way. So I think we really need to find ways to make the local networks much, much stronger. And I wish I were a funder, then that's what I would fund. But I'm not. But yeah, if you have ideas in terms of, if you see something interesting happening, or you think that, and that's my call to action for this group, right? If Brazil is big enough that you get a lot of international attention, now India is getting that way as well. And the question is, how do you leverage that? Right? So how do you get, you'll have people coming and visiting. How do you leverage that such that we should really share that? Like if someone's giving a talk, especially now in the pandemic, if they're giving a virtual talk in India, like why don't we throw it open to, the rest of the global south? Like what's to prevent? And yes, it might be more about India, but you might still learn something. So I think we should think creatively with technology.
Totally. Those are great points. I think Adriana has a final question.
Hello, everyone. My question is, let me turn on the video and then you can see my face. So, hello. My question is about the research in India about the pregnancy, the women during pregnancy, because here in Brazil, when a woman finds out she's pregnant, she starts to take the folic acid as soon as it's possible. My sister got pregnant last year, and this is common. It's like they even came to the doctor to check if the baby is alive and growing up okay. They start to take the pills. But I have never been pregnant, so I don't know the side effects of taking these pills, because my sister lives far away from here. And my question is about, is this about the culture of giving up taking the pills there that makes women don't take it, or is it about the side effects? And then after weeks they give up.
And actually, it's very interesting. See, this is where we can learn, right? Because now I'm thinking, like, if women in Brazil are taking the pills, and it seems to be, and if it's true of both rural and urban Brazil, both lower middle class and upper middle class, if it's true across, then it makes me think, right? If people are doing it in that country, then why can't they do it in India? Whereas in the US, if you tell me all women take pills, I'm like, of course, like everybody is rich in the US by Indian standards. So of course, if they're taking the pill, it's not such a big deal, right? So this is where I think actually the South-South collaboration can help and can work, because then I might say, okay, what has been done in Brazil? What have you tried that everyone takes the pill? And can we try some of that in India? Or can we try some of that in Kenya? And that's why I think it's so important that we sort of collaborate and share ideas. I don't think it is, I think, Brazil's done a good job. It might be your medical system. I know that someone was studying it to understand how to operate it in India. I think it's a pretty good system. It could be years of, socialism, etc. That maybe that's the reason it sort of came up, or that it's done well. But it would be really interesting. I would love to offline, touch base about what is it? And now it's become so much a part of the culture, you don't even think about it, right? So that's where we want to get to in India and to many other countries of the world. And that's why this is a prime example.
Well, what I learned from my sister is there is a common sense. When you when you get pregnant, it's important taking these pills, because it prevents some damage in the brain or other parts of the baby body.
But that's come from a lot of like education and awareness over many years. So that's why, so I think that's and it's worth learning from that. So I think what you've thrown up is a great example of why we should study countries other than weird countries when we are trying to do something. Because, and I'll just end with like a really nice, so when I was in Unilever, many of and even in Pepsi, many of the Indian managers were not sent to London or the US. They went to countries in Africa, and I remember to Latin America in particular. So they often went and not at low levels, at very high levels. So they would go as a country manager of Mexico or Brazil, and I thought, oh, that's strange. Like, why would they go from India to Mexico? But then the culture is so similar. The distribution systems are similar. The sort of thing is similar. Because you would think they don't speak any Spanish, they don't speak any Portuguese. It's better to send them to an English-speaking country, right? So why send them to this? But they were actually very effective because other than the language, which they catch once you're in the country, the systems are very similar and the culture was very similar. So they actually were able to actually do things that, you know, if they had gone to the US or to the UK, they wouldn't have. So that's why I think that other than language, once we can get around language, there's much more similarity in many of our countries, you know, than there is maybe with weird populations. And that's why I think we should exchange more notes.
Yes, it's true. My consideration is here in Brazil, we have a lot of difference between the regions. We are from Southwest, so we have better resources.
Yeah.
But we don't know how people live in North or Northeast. Yeah. And this is true. It's common sense among the women around us, but I don't know the other people from lower income. But in fact, what I was thinking about during your speech is our campaign, vaccinations campaign during last couple 20 years. Normally, all the vaccines are for free here in Brazil. Of course, if you
in India as well, yeah.
Want to pay private, you can, it's okay. But people use it to take their children to the doctor or in hospital because the vaccines, even they are a small child, like babies, or they are older, 5 years or a bit more. But the thing is, during this pandemic time, the families didn't do that because they are afraid of it.
Huge problem in India. So they said the biggest problem in India is not COVID. It's going to be all these other diseases because the rest of the healthcare system has stopped because of COVID. So it's immunization, it's tuberculosis. India has one of the highest tuberculosis rates. People are not getting their treatment for tuberculosis. So we haven't, you know, in India, they haven't even reached the tip of the iceberg. You'll end up with coronavirus, but there's many other. There was just an article which I'll send around on how immunizations have actually not taken place because of coronavirus. So very similar, very similar.
Yeah. So Neela, I'd like to thank you a lot for your participation today in our group. It was a really great discussion, and well, we're totally on board with any ideas that you would like to promote about South-South collaborations. I'm sure a lot of people here would like to join and help in other ways possible. So yes, if you want to say anything else, but thank you so much.
No, thank you. Let's stay in touch. Love to hear ideas. And if there's anything that through Flora, if there's anything I can send you actually on the Busara site, there's more detail about the anemia project. So I can send that to you guys if you're interested. You can see what the interventions were, what we ran, etc. But thank you.
Good. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Bye. Tchau, pessoal. Até o próximo encontro.
Tchau, tchau.
Obrigado, pessoal. A gravação vai ficar disponível em breve.
Beleza, gente. Boa noite.
Boa noite.
Valeu.